It was supposed to be just another quiet flight, until a man with Hollywood's most recognizable face boarded in silence, using a fake name. Michael B. Jordan wanted peace, but what he got was a nightmare at 40,000 feet. A racist pilot, a chilling confrontation, and a secret that even first class couldn't shield him from. But what no one knew, what would leave everyone shaken to the core, was the real reason Michael was on that plane. Why would a global superstar risk his life on a flight no one was meant to survive? The terminal was unusually quiet for a Monday morning, the kind of eerie silence that only precedes turbulence, emotional or atmospheric. Michael B. Jordan sat alone in the private lounge of an elite airline, face hidden beneath a hoodie, sunglasses tucked low. He wasn't just avoiding fans. Today, he was avoiding being known. His boarding pass bore the name Miles Carter, and even his assistant, who arranged the ticket, wasn't aware of the full plan. Michael had grown tired of the bubble fame had built around him, and for once, he wanted to experience something raw, unfiltered, real. No cameras, no filters, no curated moments. Just the cold, real world. As he boarded the flight attendants smiled, unaware of who he truly was. He was escorted to first class, where only 4 other passengers sat in plush leather seats, 2 of whom gave him polite nods. But one, an older man seated closest to the cockpit, held his stare just a second too long. Captain Graham R. Langley had flown commercial aircrafts for 2 decades. Decorated veteran, clean record, charming southern drawl. But behind the aviator shades was a different man, one who grew up believing certain people should stay in their lane. As Michael passed him on the way to his seat, something shifted in Graham's gaze. He'd seen that face before, countless times. Action films, interviews, magazine covers. But now, seeing it up close, lounging in first class under a false name, Langley's stomach twisted. Something about it irked him, how calm Michael seemed, how comfortably he blended into a world Langley still believed wasn't built for men like him. The plane took off smoothly. Champagne was offered. Michael politely declined, requesting water instead. He pulled out a notebook from his carry-on, scribbling thoughts only he could decode. A middle-aged white couple seated across from him whispered to each other after glancing his way, but made no approach. Yet, Langley, who should have remained in the cockpit, kept exiting under the pretense of checking on the crew. Each pass by Michael's seat lingered longer than the last. The flight attendants noticed. Puzzled. Something about the pilot's demeanor felt off. Then came the first minor incident. An attendant accidentally bumped into Michael's tray and spilled water. As she apologized profusely, Michael smiled and helped clean up. But Langley saw it from a distance and muttered into his comms, "He's causing issues already." The comment was noted but dismissed by the co-pilot, who'd flown with Langley long enough to know when not to ask questions. By the second hour of the flight, as the plane soared over the Midwest, a subtle tension blanketed the cabin. Michael noticed it, the tight smiles, the way the flight crew seemed caught between professionalism and uncertainty. It wasn't paranoia. He'd experienced this before, that moment when politeness becomes performance. Still, he remained calm, even gracious, speaking softly to the attendants and jotting thoughts in his notebook. He had a reason to be on this flight. And it wasn't just to escape attention, it was to observe. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Langley couldn't shake the feeling of being tested. He had spent years in control, above scrutiny, revered as both a captain and a man of principle. But seeing a black man, especially a rich, famous one, move through first class like he owned the sky, stirred something dark and old within him. Something he'd long kept buried under medals and smiles. He reached into a side compartment and pulled out an old photograph. His father, also a pilot, who was once forced into early retirement after a dispute with a black air marshal. Entitled, his father had called him, "Thinks the sky belongs to everyone." Back in the cabin, turbulence jolted the aircraft, just slightly. Michael calmly adjusted his seatbelt, as did the others. But when Langley's voice came over the intercom moments later, something in his tone was different. Less mechanical, more personal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing slight turbulence. Stay in your seats. And to the gentleman in seat 1A, let's not make any trouble, all right?" The entire cabin froze. All eyes turned to Michael, whose brow furrowed in confusion. The attendant nearest him looked mortified. He raised his hand slightly. "I'm not doing anything," he said, measured and composed. Langley didn't reply. That was the moment everything changed. The false calm shattered. Not with a bang, but with a chill, the realization that something deeply wrong was brewing in the clouds. And Michael B. Jordan, armed with more than just fame, was about to face it head-on. Captain Graham Langley had always known how to wear a mask. To passengers, he was the gold standard, well-spoken, courteous, the kind of man who said "man, sir" without sounding rehearsed. But the man behind the uniform was shaped by years of bitterness, disappointments that had calcified into hatred, and a deep conviction that the world had been stolen by people who didn't earn it the right way. He never said it aloud, of course, not at church, not to his neighbors, not even to his wife, who assumed his tense silences were symptoms of the job. But the resentment was there, pulsing quietly beneath the surface. And when Michael B. Jordan boarded his aircraft that morning, something in Langley snapped into focus. He couldn't stop watching him. Each glance was a reminder of everything Langley felt he'd lost. His once certain place in the world had become fragile in recent years. New policies, diversity training, young pilots getting fast-tracked into senior positions. And now, here was this man, sitting in first class as if it were his birthright, under a fake name no less, hiding like a criminal. The recognition was slow but inevitable. Langley had seen Creed, had seen Black Panther, and though he pretended he hadn't, he'd read the articles, seen the magazine covers. He knew who this man was. And that realization brought heat to his chest, not from admiration, but indignation. He didn't think someone like him had any business up here, not in the sky, not on his plane. Back in the cockpit, Langley ran his fingers over the throttle controls, jaw tight. He couldn't let it go. He kept replaying the moments, Michael walking down the aisle, the casual nod, the way he looked out the window like he owned the view. Langley saw defiance in every move, arrogance in every breath. His co-pilot, Jennings, noticed the change. "You good?" he asked lightly. Langley nodded, but didn't speak. He couldn't share what was going through his head. Jennings wouldn't understand. No one would. He had to act. Not violently, not yet. But he had to make it clear who was in charge up here. This was his domain, his airspace. And if someone thought they could undermine that, they'd be reminded just how small they were. Flashbacks clawed their way into Langley's mind. He was 15 when his father, also a commercial pilot, lost his job after an altercation with a black air marshal over cockpit protocols. The story that circulated said it was a miscommunication, but Graham had heard the fight. He remembered the slur his father had used, the shouting, the tears. He remembered the sound of their family's front door slamming shut after the dismissal letter came. They'd lost their house 6 months later. "They took everything from us," his father had said, as if they were a single person, a single face. Graham had never forgotten. And now, decades later, that face sat 20 feet behind the cockpit, quiet, composed, powerful. Langley's obsession turned surgical. He began watching the cabin feed, zooming in on Michael's expressions. He scrutinized how the attendants spoke to him, how they smiled. Were they intimidated? Were they placating him? Did they know who he was? Was he plotting something? What if this was more than just a regular flight? Langley's paranoia began to spiral. In his mind, Michael wasn't just a passenger. He was a threat. A symbol of everything wrong with the new world, where appearance beat experience, where charm beat discipline, where celebrity beat honor. That belief, twisted and hardened over years, bloomed into something darker mid-air. He left the cockpit again, ostensibly to inspect cabin operations. But really, he wanted to see him up close. He walked slowly, savoring the control. When he passed by Michael's seat, he leaned slightly and said, "Hope you're enjoying the ride, Mr. Carter. Or is it something else?" Michael looked up, mildly startled but unbothered. "Just trying to get to LA," he replied calmly. Langley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll make sure you land safe. As long as you follow the rules." Michael said nothing, but the attendant nearby stiffened. Something in Langley's tone had crossed a line. When the pilot returned to the cockpit, she approached Michael. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked in a hushed voice. Michael looked her in the eye and said, "Keep an eye on him." The attendant blinked. "Why?" Michael's reply was quiet. "Because I've seen this look before. And it never ends well." Langley sat back in his seat, gripping the yoke even though autopilot was engaged. He opened a side drawer and pulled out a worn journal. Inside were news clippings, photos, names. Men who'd made headlines. Black men. CEOs, athletes, politicians. He'd written short notes next to each one: corporate pawn, media darling, token hero. When he'd added Michael B. Jordan's name a year ago, it wasn't out of fandom. It was out of contempt. Langley had long believed that someone like Michael represented a false narrative, a lie about opportunity and merit. And now, fate had put that lie on his plane. The lines between reality and vendetta blurred. Langley started believing that this was his moment, not just to confront Michael, but to deliver a message. To restore what he saw as order. He picked up the intercom, hesitated, then put it down. Not yet. Not without witnesses. Not without leverage. He'd wait until turbulence again. Until the passengers were anxious. That's when people listened. That's when people believed. In his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the last line of dignity in a world spinning out of control. And at 40,000 feet, with the world far below and no oversight above, Captain Langley had no intention of staying silent. At exactly 37,000 feet, the sky shifted from serene to sinister. The aircraft jolted once, then again, subtle bumps, nothing extreme, but enough to unnerve the more anxious passengers. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a chime, and murmurs flickered through first class like static. Michael B. Jordan, still calm, glanced at the flight attendant who now hovered near his row. Her posture was rigid, her smile mechanical. He nodded subtly, acknowledging her quiet worry. What neither of them could have known was that turbulence wasn't just atmospheric, it was human, and its epicenter was in the cockpit. Captain Langley had been waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. And it had come. The moment the aircraft shivered, Langley unbuckled and exited the cockpit. It was an unusual action. Captains rarely, if ever, left the controls during weather instability unless something urgent demanded it. Yet Langley moved with deliberate calm, brushing past the crew and walking straight into the first-class cabin like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield. The co-pilot, Jennings, barely noticed at first. He was focused on adjusting altitude slightly to cut through the turbulence. But when he turned and saw Langley gone, a flicker of concern flashed across his face. Langley didn't announce his presence. He stood still at the front of the cabin, his eyes locking on Michael. The other passengers looked up, confused. "Ladies and gentlemen," Langley said, his voice sharp, tinged with disdain. "We have a situation in this cabin. One of our passengers is flying under a false identity. That's a violation of FAA regulations and, depending on intent, could be considered a federal offense." Gasps echoed. A woman clutched her pearls. The man in 2C narrowed his eyes at Michael. Michael remained silent, composed, the edge of his jaw twitching. He slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing his face to the entire cabin. Recognition hit like lightning. Even those who weren't film buffs knew the face. The expressions shifted from suspicion to awe, then to confusion. Why would someone like him be hiding? Why would a global celebrity fly under an alias? Langley took a step closer. "Mr. Jordan, or should I say Miles Carter, mind explaining to everyone what exactly you're doing on this flight under a fake name?" Michael looked directly at Langley, voice steady. "I was advised to fly privately for security reasons. Not everyone in the world means me well, Captain. Especially people like you." That sentence hung in the air like a blade. One of the flight attendants moved as if to intervene, but Langley raised his hand. "This isn't about race," he said, already on the defensive. "It's about protocol. It's about transparency. This man could be a threat." The silence that followed was deafening. The implication landed like a stone. A black man. A false name. A high-profile flight. It didn't matter who he was, the moment the seed of doubt was planted, it grew. But not everyone bought into it. The woman across the aisle, a business executive who had been quiet until now, raised her voice. "You're out of line, Captain. This man hasn't done anything except sit quietly and mind his business. You're the one disrupting the flight." Langley's eyes twitched, but he masked it with a forced chuckle. This isn't your concern. I'm ensuring the safety of everyone on board." He turned back to Michael. "You think you can just move through life unchecked because you're famous. But up here, in my plane, you're just another passenger. You don't get special treatment." Michael stood up. Slowly, deliberately. His height dwarfed Langley. His voice dropped an octave. "I never asked for special treatment. I just wanted to get from one city to another without being profiled. But you made that impossible." The tension cracked into a quiet uproar. Passengers murmured, filming with their phones now. One man was already uploading the moment to social media. The narrative was slipping out of Langley's control, and he knew it. His face flushed. He pointed a trembling finger at Michael. "You're a manipulator. You people always twist things into a sob story." The silence that followed wasn't confused anymore. It was repulsed. That phrase, "you people," turned every passenger into a witness. A line had been crossed, not just professionally, but morally. A flight attendant stepped between them. "Captain, please return to the cockpit," she said, trembling. "You're compromising the cabin." Langley ignored her. His voice grew louder, veins visible on his neck. "He's a fraud. A threat. You're all blind." Jennings finally emerged from the cockpit. His face was pale. "Langley, step back. Now." The co-pilot's voice carried authority. Langley turned to him, breathing heavily. "You don't get it, do you? They're replacing us. One by one. You'll see." Michael didn't flinch. He looked around the cabin, seeing faces torn between fear and disbelief. "This isn't about a seat or a name," he said quietly. "It's about power. Who gets to feel safe, and who doesn't." He reached into his jacket slowly, carefully, causing a few passengers to gasp, and pulled out a government-issued badge. "I'm on assignment. Federal clearance. I'm part of a multi-agency audit of flight security. And you just failed every part of it." Langley's world tilted. For a moment, he swayed as though the floor beneath him vanished. Jennings looked stunned. The flight attendant covered her mouth. Even the passengers gasped again, this time not from fear, but from revelation. Michael continued, "I wasn't going to reveal it. But you left me no choice. Your personal bias became a national security risk." Langley stared at the badge, then at Michael's unreadable expression. And in that moment, the mask cracked. Everything he believed about control, about superiority, about his domain collapsed under the weight of his own actions. Michael sat back down. The co-pilot took Langley by the arm and began escorting him away. The captain didn't resist. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. What began as turbulence had turned into something far more dangerous, a human storm fueled by hatred, unraveled by truth. And above the clouds, justice had quietly taken flight. The air inside the cabin had shifted entirely. The kind of shift that didn't just hush people, it rewired them. After Michael revealed the badge, a current of realization swept across the rows of seats like a rippling wave. Passengers were no longer watching a celebrity scandal unfold, they were witnessing something much more profound. Michael B. Jordan wasn't just a Hollywood face trapped in a racial profiling incident. He was on a mission. And suddenly, every glance, every word, every movement he had made since boarding took on a new, calculated meaning. The flight attendants, the co-pilot, even the man in 2C who had doubted him at first, all of them looked at him with new eyes. What they had dismissed as calm reserve now seemed like poise under pressure. What they had mistaken for anonymity now looked like strategic camouflage. Michael sat back, the cabin buzzing with quiet questions. He didn't speak again for several minutes. There was nothing performative about his silence, no need to explain further. The badge had spoken. But behind his still expression, his mind was alert, every synapse burning. This mission had been greenlit by a covert Federal Aviation Committee designed to assess risks within commercial airlines, especially internal ones. With recent whistleblower leaks about pilot misconduct and overlooked racial bias in elite aviation circles, the government needed someone both competent and invisible within the industry. Michael wasn't an agent in the traditional sense. But his fame made him perfect. Who would ever expect a man so visible to work undercover? The plan had been simple in theory. Board the plane under a false name, evaluate in-flight staff behavior, test identity screening protocols, and document any anomalies from a racial or security-based lens. The identity Miles Carter had been vetted, the badge buried under layers of encrypted validation. Michael had done similar volunteer work with other justice initiatives before, quietly donating to civil rights cases, attending reform panels off-camera. But this assignment had hit a personal nerve. The skies had never felt entirely safe for him, even as a frequent flyer. There was a difference between first-class treatment and true respect. And now, the test had yielded more than anyone anticipated. In the minutes after Langley's removal, Jennings locked the cockpit and assumed full command. The co-pilot made a calm announcement assuring passengers that everything was under control. But nothing was under control, at least not emotionally. The crew whispered nervously among themselves. The male flight attendant who had previously served Michael now paced, visibly shaken. "Did you know?" he asked one of the female attendants. "That he was federal?" She shook her head. "No one knew. But I knew something was off with Langley. The way he kept watching him." Michael finally stood again, slowly. He walked toward the galley where the attendants had gathered. "I need the cabin manifest," he said softly. "And the flight logs. Everything that passed through Langley's hands since this plane was prepped." The attendants hesitated for a moment, still unsure whether to follow orders from a passenger, even one with a badge. But then one of them nodded and disappeared into the cockpit's adjacent archive panel. She returned with a thin tablet and handed it over. Michael swiped through rapidly. He wasn't just looking for names, he was tracking behavioral patterns, shifts in maintenance logs, and potentially manipulated flight plans. One entry caught his eye, a strange note in Langley's handwriting from 3 days ago during an overnight flight to Denver. Passenger 4A requested cockpit access. Denied. Unregistered complaint. Michael flagged it. There was a pattern. Langley had been targeting people before, passengers who fit a certain profile, then twisting their actions into fabricated risks. But Michael also knew this incident was no fluke. He had been baited. Not just as a test of Langley's character, but as part of something deeper. There had been whispers, off-the-record conversations about a small but dangerous circle of pilots who shared a private encrypted forum where grievances about modern aviation turned into racially charged hate speech. The FAA had been trying to penetrate the group for months. Michael had been told there was a possibility Langley was a member. That if pushed far enough, he would reveal not just bias, but active participation. And now, he had. In front of witnesses. On record. Jennings re-entered the cabin, visibly uneasy but composed. He approached Michael, voice low. "We're diverting to a military airstrip. Protocol says this has to be processed off-grid before media gets wind." Michael nodded. "Understood. But we need to make sure Langley doesn't speak to anyone. Not until federal investigators arrive." Jennings hesitated. "There's something else. Before we locked the cockpit, I noticed a hidden panel in the floor. Langley must have been using it recently. Maybe for personal storage, maybe something else." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Show me." They returned to the cockpit and unlatched the small panel beneath the captain's seat. Inside was a sealed envelope, a flash drive, and what appeared to be printed photos. Michael carefully opened the envelope and froze. The photos weren't just random snapshots. They were surveillance images of other black public figures, some in airports, some boarding planes, some unaware they were being photographed. The flash drive would later confirm the worst. Langley had been collecting data for months, perhaps years, building a dossier on high-profile black flyers. The motivation wasn't financial. It was ideological. Back in the cabin, no one dared speak. The passengers had been given vague reassurances, but tension still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Michael returned to his seat, no longer hiding, no longer playing the anonymous role. The curtain between first class and coach was now open, literally and metaphorically. Everyone had seen what had happened. Everyone was asking the same silent question. How deep does this go? Michael exhaled. He wasn't just part of a mission now. He was in the center of something bigger. And whatever came next would test more than his acting skills or badge authority. It would test the system's willingness to confront its own rot. The jet's engines hummed with a deceptive calm as the plane sliced through the clouds, but inside, the cabin felt like the eye of a brewing storm. Though Langley had been removed and Michael's true identity exposed, an eerie tension gripped the passengers and crew. No one was fully at ease. Whispers passed between rows. Every glance carried weight. The plane felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls themselves were listening. Michael sat motionless, analyzing everything in the flight logs, but in his gut, he knew something was still off. Langley's unhinged behavior wasn't just the outburst of a racist mind unraveling, it was too orchestrated, too clean. The flash drive had been hidden with care. The photos were catalogued in order. These weren't the actions of a man spiraling. They were the movements of someone executing a plan. Jennings stood quietly in the cockpit, watching the radar, but his eyes often drifted to the sealed panel on the floor where the hidden drive had been. His fingers tapped against the yoke even though the autopilot was engaged. Michael returned to him with the drive in hand, lowering his voice. This wasn't just his personal stash. These are surveillance photos, tracked routines, timestamps, flight paths. You ever hear of Flight Watchdog? Jennings's brows furrowed. The FAA auditing firm. Michael nodded. No, that's the public-facing name. But there's another version. A private group that uses ex-pilots and intelligence contractors to flag non-conforming personnel in aviation. They claim to monitor security lapses, but in practice, they profile and collect data. Mostly on minority staff, passengers, and executives. Jennings went pale. You're saying Langley was part of that? Michael's eyes locked with his. I'm saying he was a node. And we just cut one wire. But there's a web. Michael slid the flash drive into a secured tablet provided by the crew. It was encrypted, but not beyond his access. He wasn't just working with the FAA, he'd been given temporary federal clearance for cybersecurity data extraction. Within seconds, the screen populated with folder after folder. Names, locations, communication logs, flight rosters cross-referenced with internal disciplinary actions. The deeper he scrolled, the more it became evident, this wasn't just a rogue pilot. It was a coordinated shadow network operating within commercial aviation. Langley's job wasn't just flying planes. He was collecting intelligence for a cause, and someone else had to be pulling the strings. Among the data files was a chat log between Langley and someone identified only as Talon 9. Their last exchange was less than 24 hours before the flight. Target confirmed on Flight 108. Keep control until drop. Record interactions. Trigger if provoked. Michael stared at that message, heart pounding. This hadn't been random. He was the target. This flight wasn't a coincidence, it was a setup. And it was still live. Drop could mean anything. A leak. An arrest. Worse. He turned to Jennings. We need a full security sweep. Right now. Bags, compartments, cargo. Everything. Jennings, now fully convinced of the gravity, relayed the order to the crew. Flight attendants, hands trembling, began checking every unsealed bag in the overheads, every drawer, every corner. Passengers watched, wide-eyed. In the back of the plane, a retired naval officer identified a suspicious parcel in the supply closet, an unmarked black case, wedged behind emergency gear. Jennings opened it while Michael hovered nearby. Inside wasn't a bomb or a weapon. It was a broadcasting unit, a high-frequency signal jammer capable of intercepting and transmitting cockpit audio externally. It had been recording the entire flight and feeding it somewhere in real time. Michael knelt next to the device, examining its origin. Military-grade tech. not civilian. This wasn't meant for the FAA, he whispered. This was meant to embarrass the government. Someone had been watching, waiting to capture Michael B. Jordan, a global icon, lose his composure mid-flight in a racially charged altercation, broadcasted to a carefully selected group. And when he didn't react with violence or fear, when he didn't give them the outburst they hoped for, Langley had escalated. They were trying to bait a narrative. But they hadn't expected a counterintelligence response. They hadn't expected Michael to flip the entire narrative on its head. Suddenly, the intercom crackled. A new voice, female, calm, precise. Flight 108, this is Tower Alpha. Be advised, your landing has been diverted. New clearance code coming through. Jennings responded with the standard protocol. But the transmission wasn't from a military strip. The code didn't match anything in the known FAA database. Michael leaned over the tablet and cross-referenced the frequency. His blood ran cold. The transmission wasn't from a tower. It was being spoofed, from the ground, near a decommissioned airfield known for military experiments. Someone was trying to redirect the plane. Not just off course, but potentially off-grid. We can't land there, Michael said sharply. Jennings didn't ask why. He trusted him now. With quick action, Jennings sent a manual override request to FAA command, flagging the code as compromised. A tense minute passed. Then a reply. Confirmed. Maintain original course. Ground team en route to intercept. The threat had been neutralized, but just barely. The enemy was bigger, closer, and bolder than anyone realized. Langley, now restrained in the crew quarters with cuffs secured by a passenger who was ex-military, had gone silent. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, lips moving in what appeared to be prayer or mantra. They'll know, he whispered repeatedly. They'll see what I saw. Michael passed him once, pausing just briefly. You didn't see the world burning, he said. You just couldn't stand watching someone else rise from the smoke. As the aircraft began its slow descent back into controlled airspace, escorted by two unmarked jets, the passengers leaned toward the windows, witnessing what no one had expected, a historic interception not of terrorists, but of internal terrorism. And still, Michael remained composed. The mission had changed. It was no longer about exposure. It was about survival. And the real war, he now knew, wouldn't be fought in the sky. It would be fought on the ground, in courtrooms and conference rooms, in the systems that had let a man like Langley climb so high while hiding so much. The wheels struck the tarmac with a jolt that felt more symbolic than physical, like the sky itself had released its breath. Flight 108 touched down under the watchful eyes of armed security teams, federal investigators, and ground crew who had been rushed into position within the last hour. Two unmarked black SUVs idled on the far edge of the runway, engines humming. This was no ordinary landing. There were no public terminals, no cameras waiting, no applause. Just cold silence and the chill of exposure. The passengers were instructed to remain seated as masked officials boarded with swift efficiency. No shouting, no panic, just solemn urgency as they moved down the aisle. Langley was escorted out first, hands still cuffed, face emotionless, a hollow man who had staked everything on a belief now shattered under floodlights and federal protocol. He didn't look back. Not once. Michael remained seated, watching through the window as Langley was placed into one of the SUVs. The moment should have brought some closure, but it didn't. Not because justice hadn't been served, but because it had come far too late. Langley wasn't an anomaly. He was the face of a deeper infection, a systemic rot that had embedded itself in the very fabric of security, trust, and aviation authority. As passengers disembarked one by one, they each gave Michael a look, some apologetic, some grateful, some ashamed. A few stopped to thank him. One older woman gripped his hand and whispered, "You made us see." But the weight in Michael's chest didn't lighten. He hadn't done this for recognition. He had done it because he knew that somewhere a young black kid was learning to fly, dreaming of soaring, and he deserved to believe that the sky belonged to him, too. Outside the aircraft, Michael was quietly pulled aside by a senior official. She was tall, African-American, with the air of someone used to leading when others faltered. "Jordan," she said, not as a greeting but as a confirmation. "You handled yourself better than half the agents I've worked with." Michael gave a tired half-smile. "Wasn't acting today." She nodded, handing him a tablet. "You need to see this." On the screen was a series of internal emails flagged from the aviation contractor group behind Langley's original recruitment. The messages included names, some in government, some in airport security, even a few in media. The scandal was bigger than anticipated. Michael scrolled, jaw tight. He had suspected a network, but this was something else. Not just bias, but a coordinated effort to infiltrate commercial systems under the guise of preserving tradition, protocol, and airline excellence. It was terrorism of a different flavor, dressed in uniforms, badges, and pilot wings. Back in the hangar, news had already begun leaking. A Twitter thread had gone viral, posted by a tech entrepreneur seated in coach who had recorded Langley's outburst and Michael's quiet composure. Though names hadn't been officially released yet, speculation ran wild. Some thought it was part of a movie shoot. Others believed it was staged activism. But the real story, the classified nature of Michael's mission, remained sealed for now. Jennings, the co-pilot, offered a statement to investigators and was cleared of any wrongdoing. He had acted under immense pressure and done the right thing. Before parting ways, he shook Michael's hand and said, "You didn't just stop a man. You stopped a movement." Michael walked past reporters gathering outside the gates, their shouts muffled by security and distance. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. This wasn't a press tour. This was cleanup. The kind of aftermath no one wanted to admit was needed. At his hotel, a sealed envelope waited on the desk. No return address. Just a red stamp marked S-Class. Inside was a note. "You weren't supposed to win. But now that you did, we'll have to adapt." No signature. No threat. Just a quiet promise that this wasn't over. Michael folded the paper and burned it in the bathroom sink. Some messages didn't deserve to exist in the world any longer. Later that night, he sat alone on the balcony, the city lights flickering below him. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, not as Michael B. Jordan the actor, not as Miles Carter the alias, not even as the undercover asset. Just as a man who had looked hatred in the face and refused to bow. He thought about the pilot who never looked back, about the forum Langley had contributed to, about how many others still hid behind cockpits and titles, convinced the world owed them obedience. And he thought about the passengers, how easily they'd believed the worst, how easily silence had almost taken root. He picked up his phone and made a call. A direct line to someone he hadn't spoken to in a year, a retired general now working with the Department of Homeland Security. "It's time," Michael said. "Not just for planes. We need to audit everything." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Then let's start with the one still flying under the radar." Michael hung up and stared into the dark, his reflection barely visible against the glass. No applause. No awards. Just the quiet realization that even in the clouds, even in first class, the fight for dignity was still ground zero. He hadn't won. He'd only survived. And survival, in a world built on quiet, coded oppression, was the loudest victory of all.